Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Kristal Marshall with me. Kristal is a former wrestler, a model, fitness model, and competitor. And one of the things I'm really excited to highlight in her journey is how when you're willing to step into new opportunities, oftentimes those opportunities will lead to where you want to go. So, Kristal, thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So to highlight, the early years for you, you had grandparents that had come over from Barbados, and then you had a dad that was in the military. So talk a little bit about, grandparents, really being first generation in America and a dad in the military and how that kind of shaped you in your younger years.
Oh my goodness, you really did your research. Yes, so I am a first generation American. Both of my grandparents, actually, both of my grandmothers came to the United States from Barbados. And they were so instrumental in me becoming quite a risk taker, to tell you the truth. Um, Both of them actually came to the US as nannies and maids, and they both landed in New York City. Um, and both just incredibly strong and industrious women. I mean, in the Caribbean, we really pride ourselves on our work ethic and on being family oriented. And, every time, especially now that I'm a mother, I think about different challenges that I may face. I always kind of take a step back and I'm like, you really shouldn't complain because
Mm.
you don't have it bad.
Yeah.
So my grandmother on my mother's side was an orphan at 2 years old. She had her first kid at 14 years old. And to support herself and her children, she ends up having four children. She cut sugarcane.
Wow.
So, yeah, she used to tell me stories about being very young and cutting sugarcane and how the women that she worked with were very judgmental because she was this young teen mom who was unwed. And she told me about a time where she had saved up enough money to buy a bicycle so that while she was pregnant, she wasn't overexhausting herself. So she could run from this cane patch to the next cane patch, without overexerting herself. And then she would go back home and get the kids ready and take them to school, all while living in a huddle house that did not have electricity. So I literally use that as perspective in my life. And I just remember her telling me before she passed away, there is no welfare, there was no any of these resources. This is a very different country. So, and I always think about myself like, it's not that bad. It's really not that hard. And you're so lucky. And I always try to use that as a way to kind of check myself and persevere, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah.
As you hear that, we're going to really understand some of the grit that you have in your journey. But as you're
Yes.
growing up, you thought, hey, I might want to go into journalism. And as a lot of people that end up in journalism do, they get into pageantry. So talk a little bit about how you guys started in pageantry and really what intrigued you about it.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, I did get into beauty pageants, and it was not. I did not have a lot of support from my parents, I would say, specifically my father. My dad, um, I always say my dad is he's a hardcore feminist. I say that because there's a joke in the family that my dad raised me to be his firstborn son. So so he was very much against me doing things like cheerleading and really using my aesthetics to advance myself. He did not support that at all. So I remember I wanted to cheer, and he said, "You can't." And I asked him why. And he said, "Well, until you see a bunch of dudes in short shorts cheering for women's sports, it's not going to happen." And I used to resent him so much for that. I really, really did. And then so when beauty pageants kind of became a thing for me, it was like, again, you don't have to do the pageantry to get to where you want to go. And I understand, dads of daughters are very protective of their girls. And so my dad was incredibly tough on me. And we used to stay up all night debating. That was his big thing. He's like, we're going to talk about this, and I want to know why you feel this way, and you better support your view. And I remember just crying all the time. And he would just shake his head. He's like, and he'd get up and leave. So that was really our dynamic growing up.
Yeah.
So he never really went to any of these things. Like he never went to any of my pageants. He never went to any of the shows that I did or anything that I did in the entertainment industry. And it's not because he didn't support me.
Yeah.
It's it was his message. Now that I'm older, I understand. He's like, okay, but there's more. Like, what are we
Mhm.
gonna do with this?
Yeah.
So I understand that, and I forgive him.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I got into beauty pageants in high school. And the first pageant that I did, oh gosh, what was it? It was Miss Teen Oxnard. And it was a regional pageant for the hometown that I grew up in. And I did not win that pageant. It was actually, no, it was, yeah, Miss Teen Oxnard. And I didn't win that pageant, but I'm so competitive that I'm like, I have to win. So I'm going to do the next one.
Yeah.
So the next one I did win. That was Miss Teen Oxnard. So after Miss Teen Oxnard, I qualified to compete in Miss California, USA. And I remember I was 17 years old. And I mean, I was so dialed in. I had did my research. I had my pageant coach at the time, and she's based in California now. She's still coaching, and she's great. Her name is Toy Foster Ortiz. Um, you know, I was rebellious by nature, obviously. So I was really good at pushing the envelope on the things that I could wear and the things that I could say because that's just who I am by nature. And I ended up getting called out for the top 10. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm going to win. I was so excited. And then I got called out for the top 5. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is it. And so they called out for the top. Well, no, let me get this straight. I don't remember if they asked us a question, top 5, and called the top 3, or if they called the top 3 and asked the question. So let's just say they called the top 3 and asked the final question. And it was myself and then 2 other ladies. And I heard the first lady's response to her question. I was like, oh, I got this. Got it in the bag, overzealous, overconfident. And I remember sitting backstage and listening to the woman who actually ended up winning that year. Her name was Candace Sanders. And I remember she was a journalism major. She was 27 years old. Mind you, I was 17.
Yeah.
And I was listening to her response. And she was so eloquent and she had this vast vocabulary. And I was backstage and I forgot what they asked her, but I'll never forget this word that she used. And it's not a very big word, but for a 17-year-old, when I heard it, I mean, the blood in my face had drained out. And she said, I have the proclivity to do something. And I said, I lost.
Yeah.
I lost. So
Wow.
I did not win that pageant, but I mean, I was devastated. I
Yeah.
was devastated because I had really showed my best. I did all the work that I thought I could do. And I took that loss very, very hard. Um, so after that, I had went on to college and I was an art major at Cal State Northridge because I paint and I do all these other creative things. So I just remembered not being happy with that outcome.
Well,
And I had blamed everybody else but myself, obviously. So I kind of had a falling out with my pageant coach and with my team. And I was like, I'm going to do this my way. Went back to Miss California next year and got my butt kicked. So, that was the end of my pageant journey,
yeah.
and I learned some really, really great lessons, from competing and about just learning from your peers and from your adversaries,
Yeah.
and really humbling yourself. Um, so yeah, there's always a learning opportunity.
Yeah. Well, something I want to jump into about what you said there is, I think oftentimes we set our goals, right? And our
Right.
goal is this. And it's like we view it as instead of, or if we view it as if I don't hit the goal, then I failed, opposed to, well, I still got
Mm,
better than where I was before, right? Because the year before you didn't finish as runner up.
Right.
Right. But that next year you got significantly better, in whatever aspect it was,
Yeah.
you presented yourself, you answered the questions. I mean, you were better. And so I think for a lot of people that ends up happening to us, and we let the miss of our original goal overshadow the fact that we are now better or we're more developed than where we were
Mm.
before. So maybe talk a little bit about that as you can reflect on it now, not being, 10 minutes after the decision, just being pissed off.
I think it was one of the most important lessons in my life that I learned now that I look back on how to lose.
Yeah.
And I feel like people look at that as such a negative thing, but like it's not the first time that I lost. It's definitely not going to be the last time that I lost, but you learn to lose with grace. And the biggest lesson that I learned from that, and it's one of my favorite quotes, is that you can be the ripest, juiciest peach, but there's going to be somebody else out there that prefers apples,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know? And
Yeah.
it's the best lesson on setting goals for yourself and being better than the person you were before because everybody has a preference,
Yep.
you know? Everyone has a preference and it doesn't matter. The goal is to show up as your best self. The goal is to do better than you were before. And that for me has been the greatest gift is to learn that, you just take things on the chin and you just kind of laugh and you keep going.
That's so
So,
good. So
yeah.
you mentioned that pageantry kind of runs its course. You head to college, but you end up deciding college isn't your thing either, and you're working at a boutique, and a prominent person comes in that day and mentions to a manager that there's this show called Price is Right, and
Yes.
maybe someone should go apply for that. So talk a little bit about that experience for you.
Yes. So speaking about my college venture and my dad and our interesting dynamic. So, when I had graduated high school, my dad was in the Navy for a very long time, and his goal was you're going to the Naval Academy. He
Hmm.
had put together my packet. I got all of my letters of recommendation. I had the grades, and he's like, "Hey, all you got to do is X, Y, Z." And I'm like, "I don't want to do that. I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that." So I ended up becoming an art major. And my parents did not like that at
Yeah.
all. They ended up kicking me out of the house. Very hard-nosed Caribbean parents. And I was like, I'm not doing that. I don't care. So I moved to LA with my duffel bag and I ended up getting a job on Melrose Avenue. And I worked at this shop called Hama. And the manager there, I have no idea why she took a liking to me. Her name was Lisa. She was from New Zealand. She was an Aussie that, grew up in New Zealand. And Lisa was deaf in, I think, her right ear, I think it was. And she's always telling me, Kristal, you're so cute. I really think that you should do this. I think you should do that. And I just kind of like, okay, Lisa, whatever. And so one day I came into work and she had this folder. And she said, this is for you. And I'm like, well, what is that? And she's like, well, Christina Milian's mother, she comes in here all the time. She buys clothes for her. And she's starting to like, kind of manage people. She thinks that, that I have a good gauge of the people that come in and they're looking for models for this show. I think you should go out for it. So I was like, all right, cool. So I went and they cast me for the role. And an interesting fact, I was actually too short for that
Hmm.
role. So all the girls on Price is Right have to be between 5'7" and 5'10" because all the wardrobe had already been pre-tailored to
Yeah.
fit those dimensions. And I'm really small. So I'm 5'2", but they really liked me, so they gave me a shot. And the set just swallowed me up. I was just so small. But I had fun and I made the most of it. And that was kind of the beginning of the snowball effect of the things that were going to come with my career.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
talking about the snowball effect, I think, so frequently we all want to get to the end result, but we have to realize for most people, right? Not everyone, but for most people, there's steps along the way, and each one is kind of a stepping stone to the next opportunity. And for you, that next opportunity was deal or no deal. So talk about
Yes.
how that opportunity kind of came to be.
Well, at that point in my life, I just had so much drive. Like I really had no fear. I think a big part of it was because I was really young.
Yeah.
And I just had no real concept of like people telling me no. So at that time, I was functioning as my own manager. So I had created an email address account, like a faux management company account. And I was submitting myself on behalf of myself, but not as myself, you know?
Yeah.
So I started booking like different music videos and different small feature positions. And I ended up getting on Deal No Deal. And I was actually in the original cast.
Wow.
So I was in there with like Layla Milani and Meghan Markle and, all the OGs of that show. Um, so that's how that came to be. I shot the pilot, and then I believe the first season, I think it is. I'm trying to remember all the details. It's kind of hard to remember, but I think it was the first season and the pilot, I believe. That's what it was. And yeah, so when it came time for the pilot to get picked up when they were shopping it around, I didn't really know for certain if it was going to get picked up. So I ended up getting cast in the WWE. They held something called a Diva Search.
Yeah.
And so the woman that was helping me with this booking at the time, she was like, I don't really think you want to do this because, Deal No Deal might get picked up and we don't really know what that's going to look like. I ended up saying, let's do it because I wanted to travel.
Yeah.
I knew there was a lot of travel. I was familiar with the brand and the business because my grandmother, when she came here from Barbados, she was a huge wrestling fan. So that was kind of like what we did was we would watch wrestling
Oh,
together.
cool.
So I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. Why not? So I ended up not winning the Diva Search, but they offered me a developmental contract, and the rest is history.
Well, the rest is just beginning for our story today. But
Yeah.
so with that, you're kind of navigating different waters, right? I mean, it's a really relatively uncharted territories from what you grew up in, and you're really doing it yourself. I mean, not having a
Yeah.
manager. Talk about that belief that you had in yourself to send out the cold emails, right? To, put yourself in the opportunities and then
Hmm.
really just to follow your intuition. I think so many people, they fear making the wrong choice that they lack making any choice, whereas you probably had some fear in the unknown, but you're like, well, I gotta try something. So talk a little bit about that for you.
For me, the biggest thing was like I knew how important my education was,
Hmm.
not only to myself, but for my family. And I had to justify not going that route.
Yeah.
So I said to myself, no matter what, I cannot fail. I have
Mhm.
to let something stick here.
Yeah.
And so I tried everything. I went out for everything. I could be anybody, I could do anything. So I did shoot some really cool stuff that, never really came to fruition. I shot a pilot with Morris Chestnut and Kevin Hart.
Yeah.
So I shot a few different things that I felt, I went out for just to try, and I didn't really have a rhyme or reason to anything. I'm just like, hey, if the opportunity is there, I'm gonna go for it. Um, and not a lot of people know. So the character of Calypso in Pirates of the Caribbean, I ended up having a screen test for that role. And how that came to be was so wild because I was in acting school and I went to Beverly Hills Playhouse. And one of the things that we would do when we'd have new actors come in is we would try to take them under our wings.
Yeah.
And, some people have never been to a casting before. Some people have no idea what an audition looks like. So there was a friend of mine that just started and she was like really terrified of casting and auditioning. And I was like, you know what? Let's just go to this casting, like this cattle call basically, where there was like hundreds of people. I was like, let's just go check it out. We'll see how it, so you can get the experience. We'll see, and I didn't think anything was going to come from it. Like I got a call back and then I'm like, well, they keep calling me back. So I'm just going to keep going. And so I remember I cut up a bed sheet and I had covered myself in dirt and I made myself look really grungy. And I was like, all right, they're calling me back now for a screen test. I gotta look good. So
Yeah.
silly me, I ended up wearing like at the time, like the low-rise jeans were really in. So I ended up wearing these like brown Shakira looking jeans and then like a cut up tank top, like not even wearing the same thing that I originally casted for in. And the director walked up to me and he goes, you look too much like a model. Absolutely not. And I was like, why did I do that? Why did I do
Yeah.
that? Yeah. So yeah, that was a really fun experience, to kind of reflect on. But yeah, I love putting myself in positions that make me uncomfortable. I really think that I thrive
Yeah.
in those conditions. But I will say that I think as I've gotten older, it makes me a little bit more uncomfortable than it did before. And
Mm.
I think I'm less of a risk taker than I was before,
Yeah.
more calculated risks, I think now.
Well, so talking about one of these calculated risks, you talked about the diva search, and you did not win, but you got extended a contract or an offer to go to, I guess, wrestling school, right? I mean,
Yes.
so talk about heading into a new industry, and it's not just modeling, it's modeling and performing, right? So talk a little bit about kind of your progression
Yeah.
through the WWE and how it started versus where it really ended.
So wrestling is just, and I don't know too much about the business nowadays because I know it has changed a lot, but it's very different. It's a very different beast. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And just like I've done before, I was like, "Ah, yeah, I'm gonna go in here. I'll do great. I'm gonna wing this. I'm gonna figure it out as I go."
Yeah.
Not the case here. That is not the case. So I remember I got the call from John Laurinaitis, and he's like, "Hey, um, we want to extend a contract to you. Would you be up to considering it?" I said, "Yeah, I'll take it." So I had to pack up and move to McDonough, Georgia, because that's where the wrestling school was. And they're like, "Yeah, just report, this time in the morning tomorrow just for some training." And I was like, "Yeah, I've been an athlete my whole life. I ran track, I played soccer. Like, I'll be fine." No, it was not fine. No, not fine at all. So, one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough, and I think because the business is changing, there's a lot less of that. There was very little respect for people that did not come up the hard way in wrestling.
Yeah.
And even for women, I did not have a wrestling background, not an amateur wrestling background. I was there solely because of the way that I look.
Mhm.
And people can debate that and say, "Oh, well, you were so good in ring." Yeah, that came with time to an extent,
Yeah.
but I was there because I looked a certain way. And so, with that being said, there were a lot of people that came up on the independent circuit that didn't have the opportunity or the connections to get to where I was. And they did not like that at all.
Mhm.
And so when it comes to wrestling and learning how to wrestle, um, the person with the knowledge in the ring is the one that controls the tempo, and they keep you safe. And you're learning from them and you have to trust them. And people were stiff. And a lot of the guys don't like that. A lot of the guys don't like the fact that they have these girls trying to wrestle now. They didn't want us wrestling. And so it was hard. And I had Bill DeMott as my coach, and he's one of the toughest. And I think I broke him down and won him over eventually because I'm so stubborn. Um, but it was a good experience, and I just have so much respect for everyone that did sacrifice so much to get to where they did the hard way, because it's not easy, and they genuinely love every bit of that business.
Yeah.
So it's
Now,
they are definitely the foundation of the wrestling business. Yeah, for sure.
now in that industry, there's so many levels, right? I mean, there's the
Mm,
people that are at the top that are, you know, getting paid well. There's people that are just trying to break into the industry and or maybe not paid as well. And part of it is you don't control the whole narrative of, the storyline of your person, right? That's
right.
kind of outside of your control. So talk a little bit about you know, even though you're progressing, there's still a level of unknown in that while you're in the
Yeah. That was hard for me because again, like I feel like I've always been able to make things kind of happen,
yeah.
and I had no control over that. So there were some things that I didn't like about that, but I felt like for once, I felt like this is the best analogy. I felt like I went from being a solo sport athlete to being a team player,
Yeah.
you know? So although I wasn't out earning people or anything like that, I knew that my role was just as important because we helped build that brand together
Yeah.
and we helped make those top earners look good, you
Mhm.
know? So wrestling as a whole, it's a family. Like I haven't seen a lot of people I worked with in years. And you go to signings or, you catch up over social media and it's like no time is left at all. It's literally like a bond that you will share for the rest of your life with these people. So yeah, I mean you can look at it and be like, "Oh yeah, that sucks I didn't get paid." Yeah, of course, I want to get paid more. But the fact that I still have a following 17 years after the fact, you might not have thought that what you were doing was significant, but you eventually time will tell how significant it was. So I don't really look at it that way.
Yeah.
I don't. I still feel like I was very successful in the business. So yeah,
Absolutely. Now,
yeah.
within that, I would imagine, as you're looking at kind of the wrestling career and, in the same phase of life, you are going to start a family. That's a really hard element that females have to deal with, probably much more than what males do. So talk a little bit about that season for you.
Not so much, not so much anymore. I do think that there is a way to balance it out
Yeah.
now. At that time, there really wasn't. So for me, it's not that I necessarily was like, oh, I have to have kids at this time. It was more so of like an alignment of a few different factors.
Yeah.
I had met my kid's dad who still wrestles, Bobby Lashley, as you guys probably already know. But
Yeah.
like I met him and we were friends for a while. And it's just one of those things where it's like you fall in love with somebody and then you're like, okay, well, how could I make this work? And then I started comparing myself, which is not good. I started comparing myself to my parents. Oh, by 24, my mom already had me and their life was already together. So I kind of looked at it as I knew that I wanted to have kids and I knew that I didn't want to, I was very up in the air about when to have kids.
Yeah.
And I think because of past experiences with different jobs, it's like, okay, so I'll have kids now. And then when I'm done having kids, give it like a couple of years and then I'll come back and I'll do the same thing. But that's not really how life works, you
Yeah.
know? So, yeah, it wasn't really like I have to give this up for that. I think motherhood for me with my career has been, I'm not giving up my career, but this is the most important thing in my life right now. I need to focus on this and be incredibly successful at this. And when this is changed and shifted and it looks different, then I can always go back and
Yeah.
do what I want to do. So it's just about prioritizing, really.
I love it. Well, to
Yeah.
to take that when it comes to prioritizing, after
Mm.
you had finished in the wrestling circle, you headed to Vegas for a competition to which you brought your son with you. So talk a little about the balancing and the prioritization.
All right. So you want to talk about a situation where things did not go according to plan, but it ended up being better. This is like the prime example.
Yeah.
So I never had any intentions on getting into fitness. I never really had an interest. I have always, and women are going to hate me, I've always been the person that's been naturally thin. I've always been athletic. I've never really cared so much to like train to make my body look a certain way. But after I had my son, I was like, okay, I want to do something now. So when I lived in Colorado, I met a girl who did compete and I saw her at the gym and we were just talking and I'm like, well, what are you doing? She's like, I'm going to compete. And I'm like, well, what is that? I don't even know what that means. And she's like, oh, well, this is what you do. And, then we do this. And I'm like, oh, I think I want to do that. And she's like, well, yeah, I have a show in Vegas and you can just come with me. Perfect. So I started training and the whole thing on that timeline was that her husband wasn't going to go. So he was going to babysit my son for me actually while I was gone, and then I'd come back and easy peasy. So I get to the airport the morning of, and I'm texting her. I'm like, "Hey, are you here?" No response.
Oh
She
no.
ended up ghosting me and not competing.
Oh
So
no.
yeah, yeah. So I ended up having to rearrange things, take my son with me, and I'm like, well, we're just gonna bring him. So I went to go check in, and I was at the Golden Nugget, and I'm carrying this baby carrier. And it's so funny about serendipitous moments. So one of my very best friends, Melissa Pittman, um, and so that name is very familiar. So her stepson plays for the Colts, and her son, it's a football name.
Yeah.
So I remember seeing her. She turns around, she goes, "Girl, do you have a baby here?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "And you look like that?" And she's like, "Oh, we're gonna help you with this baby." So literally all the girls backstage were just like helping me with my son. And I ended up winning that show. I had no idea what I was doing, but
Yeah.
I ended up winning, and it kind of was the introductory for me into the world of fitness. Yeah. And having my best friend in my life. So yeah, it's weird how that always happens, right?
Who knew, right? Who knew? So as you're joining in the fitness world now, right, there's probably certain elements of pageantry and modeling and performing that have, led you to having
Mm,
some, we'll say, natural skill in this. Um,
yes.
but there's another element, and that's the Arnold, which, in that world is just it's it's the Super Bowl. It's, right, it's the top of the top. And
Yes.
you go and compete in that. So talk a little bit about stepping into a whole new realm of, the fitness world.
Yes. So I competed. My first competition was Fitness Universe, which is one organization. And then from there, I competed in MPC because that was the first year that they had implemented the bikini division. So, and they debuted that at the Arnold Classic. So it was the first of its kind. The criteria for bikini was very, very loose. And, a lot of people there thought that I should have won and or placed better than I did. And yeah, so it was pretty controversial. But that fitness is subjective.
Yep.
It's very subjective. And again, back to losing. I am very good at losing now. But you know, that world as a whole, I competed, I turned pro, and people are like, "Well, why did you walk away?" And I feel like I accomplished everything that I could
Yeah.
and everything that I wanted to based on my moral compass,
Mm.
based on my goals, based on the things that were important to me. I
Yeah.
came, I made my mark, I had fun. You see things for what they are. And it's one of those things, again, it just was not for me.
Yep.
And it felt very familiar in a lot of ways. It felt like the things that I didn't like in wrestling. It felt like the things that I didn't like in pageantry, you know?
Yeah.
So it became less about winning for me and more so about doing my best
Yeah.
and leaving my mark.
I love it.
And that's it. I don't need anybody's ribbon. I don't need anybody's approval. I don't need any of that because um I felt fulfilled, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah.
So and it just it reinforced me shifting my perspective. That
Yeah.
was the biggest thing is just shift your perspective. And so even now still in my life, like now I'm in a whole different line of work than I ever was before. And I still look at it as the same as like, this is a new experience. What can I learn from this? How good can I get at this? And I think that the success that I'm experiencing now in the field that I'm in, it's accumulation of pageantry, athletics, wrestling, journalism. Um, it's all of it. It's all of it. And I think I feel successful, I'll say.
Yeah. So one of the
Yeah.
things that, you mentioned earlier, and I want to dive into now is just that idea of comparison and competition, and I
Hmm.
think you made a great comment earlier of, hey, you could be the best peach, right? But if someone just likes an apple more, then they're gonna go with the apple. And I think
Hmm.
so frequently in our minds, it's like we're trying to figure out the what's wrong with the peach, right? And it's like sometimes there was nothing wrong with the peach. It's just that they wanted an apple. So talk a little bit about how that perspective, has changed for you over time and how maybe today you can handle that a little bit better than 20 years ago.
A lot of it came with age.
Hmm.
And I think it's something, this is such a topic for women. I think it's a lot more relatable for us. And I feel like we are so bombarded with different beauty standards and, even as a mother, oh, so and so's kid's doing this and da 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 da. And I was so incredibly hard on myself for a long time. And I just had this drive like, you have to be the best, you have to do better. And I like that. But I like who I am now from the standpoint of, hey, did you do everything you could? Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, you're awesome. And you should be proud of yourself. And that is enough.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's like a dumbing down of society from the standpoint of people just participating. I think that for women, like I said, we're so hard on ourselves. We always try to figure out why not me? Why them? What did I do wrong? It's not that you did anything wrong. It's that there's something else that's for you. And this just isn't it. But you have to get through this valley to get to the plateau.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, I can look back at my life, all the highs and lows, and I love all of it now.
Yeah.
5 years ago, I would have been like, oh my God, this is terrible. How come this happened to me? Now I'm just like, I love all of it because I know that like I'm that much closer to my purpose of why I'm here and figuring
Mm.
out what that looks like, and it's great. And I have no jealousy about anybody or anything. We all have different stories and it's written different ways in different fonts, but it's all beautiful. And it
Yeah.
sounds cliche, but it's really true.
Absolutely.
Um, and it's funny because like some of my close friends, they're always like, dude, you're like one of the strongest people that I know. And I'm like, why? And like, well, do you remember this time? And I was like, oh yeah, it's not a big deal. And like, how could you say that? Like, how did you move on from that? And it's not that you move on from things that happen or bad experiences or challenging experiences. Again, it's like when you're grateful for those experiences and the fact that you're still standing,
Yeah.
that's when everything shifts. It really boils down to gratitude.
Yeah.
100%.
I love
Yeah.
it. Now,
Hmm.
a second question. So, you talked about your dad and yours relationship and how maybe in the very early years that was a strong motivating factor, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is interesting for a parent when you go from being the child of a parent to being the parent and you go, well, gosh, I would love for my kids to be motivated like I was, but I also don't want them to maybe feel the way I felt about
Yeah.
my parent. How do you balance that now, being a mom? How are you trying to instill that same, drive and competitiveness,
Yeah.
but maybe not in such a way where you feel like there's a rift in the relationship?
To be very honest with you, this is probably my number one struggle
Mm,
as a parent with my kids. And I have to really check myself a lot um, because I don't want my kids to be resentful. Like I did have a lot of resentment there. But at the same time, as a parent, you don't want your kids to make the same mistakes that you've made,
yeah,
you know? So, um, like I said, I fight really hard to create a safe space with my kids. I want them to be able to come to me and talk to me about things that are going on in their life, bad decisions, good decisions. Like I really want to open that up for them.
yeah,
And I just try to not yell. That
mm,
was one of the things that I hated my dad for doing. He was just like, ah, and I catch myself doing it sometimes. But the big difference is I'm aware of it
yeah,
and I'll apologize. And I think the biggest thing for parents is the things that we don't like the most about our parents or we wish were different are going to be the things that we do with our kids. Unfortunately, that's just the way that it is.
yeah,
Um, so I think just developing a certain set of awareness and just knowing, hey, that's not okay because remember when that happened to you, you didn't like how that felt. And
yeah,
although it was backed by good intentions, we all know that good intentions pave the way to hell. So I just really try to just exercise some self-awareness And if I screw up and I'm a little harsh or biting with my words, I'll tell them, "Hey, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have said it that way. I know you're working hard and I respect that. So please forgive me. I'll do better next time." And I think that's all that the kids ask for is just a little bit of that. Like, let them know that you're human
Yep.
and that you too make mistakes, and let them have a margin so they can make mistakes too.
Uh,
So,
I love it.
yeah.
Now, a second item, as people are progressing in life, oftentimes we go to people that we really trust for advice. The
Yeah.
downside is oftentimes the people that we're going to that we trust don't have a lot of knowledge in the world that we're trying to enter into, right? We go to, a mom or a dad who's never started a company, and we ask them questions about starting a company because we
Mhm.
appreciate their perspective and we trust them as humans. Unfortunately, they're just not a subject matter expert in the thing that we need advice on. And that continues on throughout life, right? We go to, this person about relationship advice and they're not in a relationship. And it's like, well, it's not that they couldn't have good advice, but I might want to go to, this person who's maybe been through that experience to give me some firsthand, hey, well, when I dealt with it, here's how I handled it. So as you
Sure.
kind of progressed in the different elements for you, how did you strategically connect with people maybe in your industry to get some advice or some words of wisdom and be able to progress quickly? Because that's the impressive thing on each thing you've done, you've been able to do it in a pretty quick amount of time, or at least seemingly quick.
Yeah. I think that was probably the biggest drawback. And I think it's why I didn't hit certain goals is I didn't really have anybody.
Mm.
And I think that's been the hardest lesson. And for me is to ask for help.
Yeah.
Um, I never really had that. And it's not that I didn't have that. I just never felt comfortable
Mm.
or safe within my relationships to ask for advice
Yeah.
or to be vulnerable that way with people and say, "Hey, I don't have the answers." Um, and I think in the past, specifically 2 years, it's been one of the most beautiful things that I've noticed about myself. There's been like this softening a bit and just really trying to honor relationships with people that may be unlikely.
Yeah.
So I went back to Denver 2 weeks ago because I used to live for 15 years. And I have a client. Her name is Phyllis, and I love her. She's in her 70s, and Phyllis never had kids. She was one of the first oil and gas female engineers in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Okay, so she came up during a time when women couldn't have checking accounts and they couldn't, buy properties. And, you know, I have known her for about 6 years. And you talk about, the people you have in your lives that you bounce ideas off of and you confide in and you seek their counsel. She would be that person.
Yeah.
And it's not because she has ever been a mother. It's not because she's ever owned her business. It's because of her age and her experience and things that she's witnessed.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know if you guys know this, but I worked in the salon industry for over 15 years, and she was one of my clients. And I think that that was one of the greatest gifts because it forced me to interface with people that I normally wouldn't have because they're from a different walk of life.
Yeah.
So her and I grew very, very close. And so I talked to her about everything, everything. Some things she probably doesn't want to hear about, some things she does.
Yeah.
But I really respect her as a person. And so therefore I value her insight. And I think for me, the respect factor is really, it's what determines if I will take advice from
Mm.
somebody.
Yeah.
And I look at it as not like, is this person fiscally successful?
Yeah.
I look at it from a standpoint of if I wouldn't trade my life for theirs, if I had to, would I? And if I would be okay with that, then I would ask advice of them.
I love it.
So
That's
yeah.
great advice.
Yep.
Well, Crystal, I want to say thanks so much for sharing your journey and all the amazing things that you've done and are continuing to doing, and excited to just continue to watch your journey. And probably 2 or 3 years from now, we'll have to be doing it again. Say, what's been
Yes.
going on in Crystal's world?
Yes. There's a lot that's going to happen in the next 2 to 4 years. So definitely let's stay in touch.
I love it.